So our objective was to use a VCSL checklist, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's a visual communication and sign language checklist, which is a standardized assessment for ages 0 to 5. And we want to be able to identify children who may be at risk for language delay and possibly determine any screening factors for further evaluation.
So there are a few main difficulties that are associated with identifying language delay in a deaf population. The first is that we don't really have a great idea about what typical signing development looks like. There hasn't been, a whole lot of solid, a full development of what that looks like. Not a lot of research about that quite yet. And then for the second reason, there's a few formal assessments that are targeted towards a deaf population that can identify a language delay in a signing modality. And then also, there is difficulty in there's a difficulty in determining the etiology of the language delay, because often the language delay, rather than being associated with a specific internal disorder, can often be associated with a lack of exposure, because 90% of deaf children are born into hearing families, so there's usually a lack of adequate and full signing exposure associated with that as well. So our research brief, which we have a few copies of here if anyone would like to take a look, it talks about these issues and many more, and it gives a lot of background information on how parents and educators can also assist and support children who may have a delay in these areas.
So like I briefly mentioned, we use the VCSL, which is a visual communication and sign language checklist. So like Maura mentioned, there are very few standardized assessment. This is one of the only ones known to actually assess American Sign Language. So deaf children are bimodal bilinguals, so they communicate expressively and receptively in American Sign Language, but they read and write in English. So a lot of assessments that are used are for English, but not for ASL, so this one is very unique. It is 114 behavioral statements that are organized in ascending order difficulty, so they are separated for each age category. So there's one from birth to 1 to 2, and pretty much filled out by parents, trained professionals, to say what their child can and cannot do. And each statement is has a 4-point rating scale. So maybe the first one in birth to 1 is like joint attention. So it'll range from not yet emerging to mastered, and they will receive a score based on that assessment. So out of the 114 behavioral statements, they'll end up getting a certain score based on what they do for that age.
So the participants in the VCSL database that we were working with, they were ASL users ranging from ages 0 to 7 years old, and they came from varying home language environments. The first step in our project was to take this whole group of participants and define a group that we considered to be language delayed. So to do that, we separated it into those who come from an all or most ASL home language environment. So those who have mostly ASL being used at home, they have a better chance of exposure, so we don't get that sort of etiology question coming into it. So these are the children who have the best chance at having adequate exposure at home. And then from that group, we defined it as those who have at least one deaf parent, also because that will give them more accurate ASL rather than a hearing parent signing. The deaf parent usually tends to have more linguistically accurate ASL. And then we took from that group those who had a language delay or a basal delay of more than 24 months compared to their peers. And then because that's a 2-year delay, we ignored those who were 2 years or under. So we have those who are ages 3, 4, and 5. And that left us with a sample of 32 children who we defined as our language delayed group for further analysis.
Oh, I can get back a second.
Oh, yeah.
So we began with a whole VCSL sample of 568, which is a pretty large number, and which is why one of the reasons why we did want to go to Gallaudet, because there was such a large deaf population there that we could start with such a large sample, and that we could eventually narrow down to our 32 interest group. So we were really excited to, even though we did travel domestically, this was such a unique population and such a unique location to be able to do this research. So we really were grateful for that. So then once we established our interest group, we said, okay, so these children are what we say more than 24 months delayed. They should be having adequate exposure, but what are these children struggling with? What are they not getting from the VCSL sample? So we decided to make 3 tables, one for age 3, one for age 4, one for age 5, and we wanted to select milestones or the behavioral statements that a lot of children were struggling with. So we were able to pick out 2 different ways, like 2 different criteria for making the list. So first we had to say, was it in the age 3 or age 4, age 5 group? So yes or no. And then the 2 ways we included the item was if 0 of our interest group in that age cohort had it as mastered. So if there's a behavioral statement and no one of our interest group had that ranked as mastered, we include it in our list. And then we also said, did half or more have it as not yet emerging? So what skills pretty much are they not have emerging? So what do they not have yet? And what skills haven't they mastered? And we compiled all those for age 3 and age 4 and age 5 to create tables.
So these are the results of that sort of organization. So these, for ages 3, 4, and 5, these are the 5 most difficult tasks for this language delayed group. So, producing 3, 4, and 5, or 3 and 4 signed sentences for 3-year-olds, using rhetorical questions, which in ASL is actually a very common sentence structure. So by age 4, they should have some understanding of that. And then at age 5, using expanded sentences with multiple traits. So these are just the first 5 on a long list. So the next step will be to examine this list further and see if we can notice any patterns in that.
So yeah, like Maura said, going forward, so we were able to see what these students were struggling with, and so we kind of got the help of an ASL linguist at Gallaudet University, who's actually a Penn State undergrad, which is kind of cool. So she is currently investigating for any sort of pattern, seeing what is occurring. We did like a preliminary look at them, seeing, okay, is it a lot of temporal things? Is it storytelling? What exactly is it? But we don't really have the credentials to say for sure. So that's currently being investigated for manuscript in progress at Gallaudet University. But overall, just to be able to use the VCSL as a possible screening tool to see, what are these children struggling with? Maybe we can have possibly early identification at a younger age, which is really exciting. So just as a possible screening tool.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Thank